Hello and welcome to Lutherans Alive. We believe that God is doing wonderful things through us, and so this is the program that seeks to tell the stories of Lutheran Christians and the ministry that they do here in Southwestern Pennsylvania. I'm Pastor Tony Schneck, pleased to be your host. Today with me on the program, Pastor Bob Keplinger from English Lutheran Church in Zelienople, Pennsylvania.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Bob, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And as this is a program that seeks to tell stories, that's precisely what you're here to talk about today, the art of storytelling and the practice of telling stories. And how has that been a part of your ministry as you have engaged in that?
Well, certainly, we are, as pastors, storytellers. That's what our faith is all about. And also we embody stories in our lives. And so the whole ministry is shaped by story. And I have come to discover that in very powerful ways. I remember a story of a gentleman in my first parish that was there in church every Sunday in a three-piece outfit, and just so dignified. You'd think he was a banker or investment counselor, and came to find out that he was a very simple man, and other than on Sunday mornings, lived very simply in plain clothes in a very plain apartment. But Sunday morning was special for him, and he, shortly after I came to the parish, he got sick and couldn't come to church anymore. So I'd visit him in his home, and over the months I saw what was a vibrant faith begin to diminish from this man. And I couldn't figure out why. I tried to get him to talk about it, and he never would. But finally realized that he had been listening to a TV program and that made an empty promise that, if he just sent his prayer request in, that he would be healed. And a simple prayer. And what prayer would God honor was to be able to get well enough to come back to church. And that didn't happen for him. And so he was left with either, I think, one of two options. Either God didn't care for him or his faith wasn't strong enough. And I really sense he died a broken man. And he told me that the story of what happened, just weeks before he died. And there was nothing I could do to console him. But that story has given shape to my ministry, ever since. And it stands out as how stories shape ministry. And, I'm very cautious about making empty promises to people in situations like that, because faith can be a very fragile thing, but it's empowered by the stories that we tell, whether in a good sense or maybe in a negative sense. But we are storytellers, and we embody the story of God's love, most of all, to one another.
Indeed, I'm reminded of the ordination service in which we made promises, and one of the things we are compelled not to do is to give false hope. We are admonished, I should say, not to give any false hope, but to give people real hope. Mm-hmm. How have you seen stories give people some real hope? What's an example you might say of a story in which someone was given some real hope?
Well, my mom just died Monday, a week ago, and her story gave me tremendous hope. Both my mom and my dad faced terminal illnesses, and they did it, which was such a sense of presence and peace. In fact, the head nurse came in just before Mom, a few days before she died, and said she never saw a woman with such peace. It was in the way that they dealt with her death and the story that they told in the process of dying to me as their son, that I discovered in a much richer way who they were, their character, their faith, more than the rest of my life. That became so real to me in the way they faced death. And I learned also about the gifts that they gave to me in my character and my faith. For example, I think the generosity that I sense that I have comes from my dad. My spirit of life comes from my mom, and a little bit of humility comes from them both. But it was in the story of how they dealt with their dying that I came to discover in a much richer and deeper way who they were and what they gave to me as their son.
Well, God be with you and your family.
Well, thank you.
And we all come with stories of both sorrow and loss and joys and thanksgivings.
Right.
We all bring our stories, and the stories of others can affect us as well. Other ways in which you're using stories in your ministry. Do you have something new that you'd want to share, something perhaps more recently? You mentioned before we went on the air today that you had something that you've been interested in recently. Can you say some things about that?
Well, I'm going to write a book. And it comes out of these experiences with my parents and my whole ministry. It's called Passing On, Short Stories About Life, Death, and the Process of Dying. And one of the chapter titles is Sometimes We Need to Get Out of the Way. You've seen in ministry, as I have, that sometimes people need to be alone to die. And so often somebody will maintain that vigil constantly and then just step out of the room for a matter of minutes, and that's when a person dies. And then they feel so guilty that they weren't there to be there in that moment for the person. So when we were facing my mom dying, we had taken, at her request, the oxygen off of her. She had reached a point of being unresponsive, and that's what was her wish, which made it so easy for us as a family, because we were not making the decisions. We were just following through on the decisions that she made, the strengths that she gave to us. And that was about 2 o'clock, and about 6:30 I sensed that I'd been sitting there too long, and I needed to give my mom the gift of space. And so I said to my siblings that I was going to leave. I wasn't mad, I wasn't upset. I just thought Mom needed the gift of being alone. I went over to say goodbye to my mom and bid her farewell and Godspeed, and told her, although she was unresponsive, I assumed that she could still hear, and she was still a part of the story that was unfolding at that point, and told her that I wouldn't see her again until we'd see each other in heaven. And I was pleased that one by one others began to follow in time. And Mom, finally when things became quiet for her, was when she died. But driving out of the parking lot after I'd made this decision, I had this vision in my mind that the angels were hovering over Mom, ready to take her home, but they couldn't come down because we were all on the way, hovering over her. And in a practical sense, I think sometimes if people can still hear, which I think they can, even though they're unresponsive, our voices, the voices of loved ones, are stimulating them and maybe keeps them from letting go. And so that's the point of the chapter, is to tell the story of the angels hovering over Mom, ready to take her home, and just to allow people to know sometimes it's just good to get out of the way in a moment like that.
Indeed, you hear stories of, on one hand, people who hang on until a loved one will come in from out of town.
Right.
But then the reverse is also true.
Right.
Sometimes people wait for their loved ones to take their leave.
Yeah.
Everyone's story is unique and different.
Very good.
Thanks for sharing your story with us so far. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back here on Lutherans Alive.
Good.
Welcome back to Lutherans Alive. We continue our conversation with Pastor Bob Keplinger from English Lutheran in Zelienople. We're talking about storytelling. And Bob, you've even brought some props with you today to show us a little bit here. Do you have some things you want to share with us?
Sure. A good storyteller always has something to share in the way of not only a story, but the things that go along with it. I was over at the Synod office before coming here and talking with Pastor Morgan, and he was telling me about being in our congregation 12 years ago, and he's coming back this fall. And he says, I still have my Ebenezer stone. And so I brought his stone with me. And the story behind this stone, and I've had a lot of fun with it over the years. I was singing that hymn, "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing," and the stanza, "Here I raise my Ebenezer." And how many times have I sang that like everybody else? And for the first time one day I asked myself, what's an Ebenezer? And so I found a story in the Bible from 1 Samuel chapter 7, where Samuel and the people of God come to a difficult place in their life, and he prays to God, and God answers their prayer, and he sets a stone there and calls it his Ebenezer, which means stone of help. So we, with the youth group, ended up buying a bunch of these stones, and the kids participating in putting the Ebenezer stone and 1 Samuel 7:12, the verse that goes with that. And we handed them out to every family in the church. And we had a talented person at that time who even wrote a little song to go with it for the children to sing. And it's a blessing for me because I go still into people's homes. And like Blair Morgan has this on his bookshelf, I'll go in, and it might be as you enter into the doorway, that might be there, it might be on the mantle or down at the bottom of the fireplace. But the symbol of it was to always be a present symbol of God's help in whatever way that we might need God to help us. And I still give these out. Every wedding that I do, I give out an Ebenezer stone. And I put their date of their wedding on it in addition to this other information, and tell them that well, I joke with the men, I always say, you'll never forget your wedding date because it's right there on the stone. But more importantly, I'll tell them that, put the stone someplace special to remind you that God is there to help you. And we know marriages struggle a lot in our culture. A lot works against healthy marriages, healthy families. So we need reminders there that there is help for us from God and certainly from other people. So that's the one thing that I thought about bringing since Blair brought it up just about a half an hour ago when I was over at the Synod office. The other one is a storytelling stick, and I had this marvelous couple when I first came to English in Zillinople almost 25 years ago. And the two families had owned a summer house together, and as their kids were growing up, they entertained them by turning their families into an Indian tribe. And so all the kids had Indian names, and they would get together around a bonfire and share stories and so forth. And so I was honored. The gentleman, the dad, the head of the tribe, made me the stick, and my Indian name was Storyteller. And so he put a cross on it. There's a symbol of the snake, a shield with a cross on it. And so it was a sense in which what ministry is about, that we are a keeper of the story of God's love for us and for the world. And I've used this stick in different ways, sometimes when I'm with children. And I realized I hadn't gotten this out for years. But I used to use it with children and give them to the child and say, now, you have to tell me a story. And everybody's got a story. Kids love to tell the stories if they're given permission and invited to do so. So that's the story behind the stick that I still cherish and take with me at different times. So.
In our conversation up until this point, we've already mentioned a few biblical references,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a good reminder for us that the written Word of God comes from a previous oral tradition.
Right.
In that before these stories were written down, before folks were inspired, before these people of faith were inspired by God to write these stories down, they were inspired to tell them.
Right.
As you say, share the story, to pass it on, perhaps sitting around a campfire.
Right.
Even the Old Testament stories and even the gospel stories about Jesus
Right.
were first told by word of mouth before they were written down. Can you say some things about that and how there's a value in passing that on through word of mouth?
Right. Well, let me go to a different background that sets the theme of it all. And there's been such an emphasis on biblical storytelling in recent years. I mean, you can go to festivals and so forth. And the latest information from Gettysburg, the brochure was something about telling the story that we love, playing on the words, I love to tell the story. But biblical storytelling will talk about paradigm shifts. And so originally stories were meant to come through the ear, long before they were ever written down. And once they became written down, then the tendency was for the story to come through the eye, through the reading of it. And I think something was lost in the power of the story, because stories are meant to come through the ear. And in biblical storytelling, they're talking now that we've entered into another paradigm shift that is, in some sense, combining the eye and the ear in modern technology. But a good example, and a very simple thing that anybody could do, I was thinking about the story of Christmas and preparing for Christmas Eve this past Christmas. And the words of that hymn, let all mortal flesh keep silence, just those words, I couldn't get them out of my mind. And what I ended up doing is I told the story, and my son helped me do that. He could do it on different tracks. But I took 3 instrumental versions of just the first verse of that, let all mortal flesh keep silent, and with fear and trembling stand. Let nothing earthly minded ponder. So I began to tell the story with the instrumental version of the song behind it, and so people could hear. And then I paused, at places like when the angel tells Mary about what's going to happen. And I could imagine in her heart and mind singing, let all mortal flesh keep silence. And so 3 different times in the story. And then I would move back to telling it with the instrumental version, and then pause at an appropriate time, and then the vocal would come in, let all mortal flesh keep silence. And so on Christmas Eve, we just turned all the lights off, except one that focused on the creche, the manger scene. And this was all pre-recorded. And people said it was so meaningful because it engaged people in the story in a very different and I think powerful way. So there's so many things that we could do creatively with storytelling that sometimes we're not taking advantage of. I mean, this Lent we've all dealt with these long Gospels, and how do you, if you just stand there in the pulpit and read it, after the first little paragraph, people are going to be shutting you down. And there's just too much if you try to do all the lessons. So what we did at English was to eliminate the reading of the other lessons, just focused on the gospel in its entirety, but did it in narration form as a dialogue between the congregation and other participants and so forth. So, with visual media and all that kind of stuff, there's so much we could do to recapture the ear, which is the powerful place for the story to come into, not the eye. But with modern technology entering into a new paradigm shift that kind of combines the two. So I think we're living in a time when storytelling will take new dimensions, and the emphasis on biblical storytelling has brought a lot of this about in recent years, and I think we'll discover even further ways to make it powerful for people to get back in touch, because I think people today don't know the stories like they used to. People just don't. And it's like singing Here I Raise My Ebenezer and never bothering to understand what I'm singing about,
To say, what's an Ebenezer?
Yeah, and right. It opens up a whole dimension to your life and to the story of your life. So,
thanks very much, Bob. We're going to have more about storytelling after we take another short break.
Good.
Thanks. Welcome back to Lutherans Alive. We're continuing our conversation with Pastor Bob Keplinger. We're talking about storytelling. And it's important for us to remember, I believe, that those biblical stories of which we have spoken are not just old stories that have happened long ago and are in the far distant past, but that really the Bible is the story of God and his people together,
Right.
the relationship. And that today we are God's people, and God's story and the story of God's people those are our stories. Can you say some things about how those two worlds, so to speak, come together, and how God's story is our story?
Sure, and I think it's really three worlds, and I learned that through a T-shirt and a logo that was given out at one of the storytelling festivals that I went to. It had three circles with a line drawn through it, and the words then, my story, our story, God's story. So really three circles to the dimension of who we are as human beings. We are a storied people, I mean, all of us have a story about where we've come from, what's been important to us, what has shaped our lives. Our character comes from our family. And so right away we recognize that my story is part of a larger story. I am who I am, as I talked earlier, because of who my dad and my mom were, and countless others that shaped my life. And whether we want to move to that third story or not is a matter of faith, and sometimes we get away from that sense. But I grew up in the church, got away from the church for a long time, and what brought me back into the church was simply my neighbor saying to me one day, Bob, what do you think about God? And I just looked at him and said, I don't know. And he was a very wise person, and I think an evangelist at the heart of things, because I came to learn that he was doing this with 3 or 4 people every week. But he didn't say anything further, but I went home, and it was like the fish that was caught. I kept asking myself 2 questions. Why would someone ask me what I thought about God? Because that was the farthest thing from my mind, and there weren't any other people coming around saying, what do you think about God? But then the more nagging question was, what do I think about God? And that prompted me to go back to him 2 days later and ask him why he shared that, or asked that question, and then he shared his faith with me. And that made the whole world a difference. That's what invited me to say that my story, and I was a pretty self-centered person at that point, so it was basically I was living my story out, and not so aware of the larger context of our story, and totally oblivious to any sense of God's story. It wasn't that I denied God its existence, or I remember praying at times. It just wasn't, that story just didn't seem to be a part of entering into my story in general. But then that invited me to see my story within the larger context of God's story, and then I kind of filled in the middle, as so to speak. But that changed my life, for me to realize that my story was part of something bigger. Someone called it a master story, for example, that it's just not me against the world, or me against everybody else, trying to make it on my own. But my story comes enmeshed in the story of others who are there with me, and certainly of God. And that's true for every human being, whether they choose to acknowledge or not. It's my story, which is part of our story, whatever context, whether it's family, church, nation, clan, and then must move on to the larger story that encompasses it all, that we're all creatures, unless we choose to deny that story altogether, somehow it's there, that's to be dealt with, And fortunately, I've come to understand it's a story of a powerful love and a powerful forgiveness, a story that will not let me go, so to speak, as Paul would say. Nothing can ever separate me from the love of Christ. That's the story that I've come to understand, that really is my master story, that gives shape to everything else.
I like that image of the three circles
Mm.
together. My story, our story, and most of all, God's story. And as we each year have Lent, I mean, isn't that in itself a powerful reminder of, on Ash Wednesday, when we hear, we're dust, and to dust we shall
Right.
return. You know, I'm dust, we're dust. Jesus came and Jesus died. But
Right.
then Easter also becomes my story,
Sure.
your story. Just as Mary Magdalene had Jesus speak her name, Jesus speaks our names, and we together will rise because we know that Jesus is risen from the dead. Easter is our story.
Right.
It's our story just as much as it is Jesus' story. That's
Right.
wonderful. Thanks so much for what you've shared today about the wonderful art of storytelling and how that can be a powerful way to share the message, to tell the old story
Right.
that we love so much. Thank you, Pastor Keplinger, so
You're
much.
welcome.
And thank you for being with us here today on Lutherans Alive. We know that each of you has a story. And we know that from wherever you're watching, in your community, near your community, there is a Lutheran congregation that would be pleased to welcome you. Won't you please come worship with us, and won't you join us next time on Lutherans Alive?